Good morning, and thank you for joining us both in person and online. My name is Bonnie Lin. I direct the China Power Project here at CSIS. I am very delighted today to use this opportunity to launch a report that we worked with a number of leading scholars from the United States, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, Singapore, and the UK on this summer. And of course, with co-sponsorship from the Prospect Foundation with Dr. Lai Yizhong here, and with generous support from Mr. Robert Cao, he was not able to join us today. But our report focuses on a key topic of looking at China's anti-secession law and the legitimacy as well as the rationale behind that law. And I think that is incredibly timely as we sit here today, because if you recall, China just recently launched another round of major military exercises around Taiwan, Joint Sword 2024B. And that reminds us that the very live possibility and perhaps growing possibility that China may use military force against the island. So it's more and more important for us to understand what underlies this Chinese logic and if there's any legitimacy or legal backing for China to do so. So I'm very delighted that we have an excellent set of experts that will speak to you today. Unfortunately, given the very large number of experts that participated in our volume, we weren't able to invite all of them here today, but we'll provide you a sample of the insights there. And for those of you who have online access right now, you can actually find the report on the CSIS website. So for today's event, we will first start with an opening speech, comments, followed by a panel discussion, and then closing comments. So let me first introduce our keynote speaker. Mr. Jonathan Meyer is a partner at Sheppard Mullen's Washington, D.C. office, where he leads the firm's national security team. He recently joined after serving as general counsel for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security under the Biden administration. With a distinguished career spanning Congress, DOJ, and DHS, Meyer specializes in national security, homeland security, government investigations, cybersecurity, and technology. As DHS's general counsel, he provided legal counsel to top leadership, led a team of 4,000 attorneys, that's a lot, and navigated groundbreaking issues like immigration, cybersecurity, and AI. He also has extensive experience defending congressional investigations in high-stakes litigation. A two-time recipient of DHS Outstanding Service Medal, Mr. Meyer holds degrees from Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and is fluent in Hebrew and French. So I think most of the time when we deal with Taiwan or foreign international issues, we don't have someone from DHS with us, or former DHS with us, but we thought, given the discussion about the legal implications as well as how other countries deal with such issues, it would be a rare opportunity for us to hear from leading U.S. experts. So with that, let me turn the floor to Mr. Myers.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Bonnie, for that very kind introduction. The word recently was really doing a lot of work in that introduction, because today is actually my second day back at my old law firm, Sheppard Mullen. So I've only recently left DHS, and it's a pleasure to join you and to be invited to address you today. Really an honor, especially on such an important topic. But I want to begin with a caveat, because while I am a lawyer and a student of international relations and interactions between governments and their citizens, I am by no means an expert on the People's Republic of China or Taiwan. As Bonnie said, my expertise is in national security law and homeland security law. So I hope you will be patient with me as I share a few thoughts. When I was in law school, a long time ago now, I wrote a law review article. Its topic was the drafting of a legal definition of international terrorism, a subject in which I've maintained an interest for decades. And while I completed the draft article, I never actually published it. One reason for that is that when I had set out to write it, I had hoped to author what I consider the ultimate law review article, and I failed at that task. As originally envisioned, the article would have consisted solely of the definition of terrorism, while dropping footnotes to explain each of the words I had carefully chosen as elements of that definition. In other words, it would have been the ultimate law review article one sentence followed by 40 pages of footnotes. But that's not why I'm telling you this story. I tell you this story because as I reviewed the writings in this wonderful new volume on China's anti-secession law in preparation for my remarks today, I was reminded of the old saying that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. That, after all, was one of the problems I was trying to solve when I was writing that article. One could argue that a similar quandary applies to the ASL. After all, one person's use of the law to regulate secession is another person's misuse of the law for political or military purposes. The advent of the 22 articles this year comes at a time of change in China's relationship with the world, and especially the United States. And in this, I do have some experience. During my 3 years in the Biden administration as General Counsel of DHS, China became a greater area of concern than it had previously been. As we responded to unidentified Chinese balloons entering U.S. airspace, as Congress charged us to enforce new rules against the importation of products produced with forced labor in China, and as we imposed closer scrutiny on corporate transactions involving Chinese investment in the U.S., as well as American investment in Chinese companies. Laws like the ASL and the recent addition of the 22 articles only heighten that concern. I spent much of the past 3 years preaching to the 4,000 lawyers of DHS and anyone else who would listen the virtues and the criticality of the rule of law in the United States. It is a central tenet of our thriving democracy. I believe that in my core. And yet sometimes what appears to be the rule of law leads to horrible results. I have to thank CSIS because I have struggled in recent years thinking about how we distinguish the good things that the rule of law can bring with the bad things that accrue when it is misused. Reviewing this report has helped clarify my thinking on that. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the school of thought that distinguishes the rule of law with rule by law. Scholars, including especially with regard to China, have contrasted the rule of law, where a properly elected power enacts laws that are enforced by an independent judiciary in a government that balances its powers, with rule by law, in which the government enacts laws not to further regulate legitimate policy areas or guide the adjudication of disputes, but simply to further the political goals of a country's leaders. As illustrated throughout this volume, China has enacted and amended the ASL, I would argue, as an act of rule by law. One way to identify rule by law is to look at whether the law actually impinges on fundamental liberties. After all, one of the common principles of true democracy is that the government can regulate much in life, but it cannot impinge on certain fundamental liberties. With the ASL, as the report's authors have pointed out in the volume, we are witnessing just such an impingement of fundamental freedoms through the passage of the ASL and the 22 articles. For example, unlike other anti-secession laws, including, frankly, our own, at 18 U.S.C. 2383, this law would prohibit freedom of expression. It prohibits not just secessionist acts, but secessionist speech. Our law, as I said, does not do that. And even our law dealing with seditious conspiracy, the next section in the code, 18 U.S.C. 2384, American law requires the use of force for a violation to occur, not mere expression. This is particularly relevant in the U.S. at a time when we are struggling with the line between freedom of expression and the damage caused by misinformation and disinformation. It's something we've spent a lot of time thinking about at DHS. As many of you know, it was the subject of a significant Supreme Court decision decided just this past June, Murphy versus Missouri. DHS was a party to that case. Whereas we in the U.S. make extraordinary efforts to find ways to fight public lies and misleading narratives without the government violating the First Amendment, China seems to take the easy way out, the more dangerous way out, the undemocratic way out, by simply cracking down on speech expressing a viewpoint they don't like. And we're not alone, we the United States, in putting fundamental democratic principles ahead of principles of anti-secession. As Julian Koo points out in the book, the vast majority of OSCE states limit criminal punishment for anti-secessionist conduct to activities involving the threat or use of force, not mere speech. This includes, of course, the US, but it also is the approach of numerous countries facing active secessionist movements: Azerbaijan, Armenia, Croatia, Estonia, Czech Republic. And beyond that, it is the approach of some of our closest allies. Many of you recall that the United Kingdom allowed a vote on Scottish independence in 2014. Canada similarly allowed Quebec an independence vote. Only authoritarian governments such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan take an approach that challenges expression itself. Unfortunately, China is a charter member of that ignominious group. The other case that comes to mind, as I at least am considering China and the ASL, is one that is at the forefront of international developments these days: the war in Ukraine. After all, like China, Russia has claimed that Ukraine is really just a renegade part of its own country, which, so it claims, deserves to be put down and forced back into its mother country. But there's an inherent flaw in that approach. Similar to Taiwan, Ukraine is already a sovereign country. In order to characterize a fight as anti-secessionist, it must have been sparked by a secession. At this point, both Ukraine and Taiwan are separate entities of long standing. Regardless of whether Russia's claim is accurate historically, and there's plenty of evidence that it is not, one cannot pretend to be fighting a secession when the territory at issue has already been a sovereign country for a considerable amount of time. Moreover, under international law, as pointed out in this report, Taiwan is already a sovereign country, as is Ukraine. That is, of course, one significant difference between the invasion of Ukraine and the ASL on one hand, and another comparator, the American Civil War, on the other. Interestingly, China's claims to be fighting an anti-secessionist war are belied by the original title it assigned to the ASL. It was originally named the National Unification Law. Note, not the Reunification Law. Only later was its name changed to the Anti-Secession Law. The PRC seems to be a bit schizophrenic, unable to decide if Taiwan is already part of China or a territory that seceded and must be reunited with it. Another indication that the ASL is an example of rule by law and not rule of law is that it doesn't actually grant the PRC any powers it didn't already have, as Donald Clark points out in the report. In other words, there is no legal or legislative need for the ASL. Why then did the CCP go to the trouble to enact the ASL and only almost 20 years later, the 22 articles? The answer must be that it was done not to modify the government's powers to address a new problem, but to send a message to those in Taiwan and in China who support the independence of Taiwan. While legislation intended primarily to send a message is not inherently anathema to democratic government, it can join with other factors to characterize more authoritarian action. I mentioned at the top that I've struggled with the tension between the laudable goal of the rule of law and the negative consequences that have resulted at times throughout history from what appears to be rule of law. This is personal to me because it has affected my family directly. At my Senate confirmation hearing 3.5 years ago, I told the story of my grandfather, who was an inspiration for my becoming a lawyer. He was a young government lawyer until his government, which had originally come to office democratically, enacted a law forbidding him to pursue his dream of practicing law and becoming a judge because he was Jewish. That was in 1933, and the government, of course, was Nazi Germany. While my grandfather, fortunately, made it out of Germany and lived a long, happy life in Southern California, he never practiced law again. How can we reconcile our worship of the rule of law with such unacceptable legal outcomes as the law to, quote, cleanse the legal profession, unquote, in Nazi Germany, and the anti-secessionist law in the People's Republic of China? One part of the answer to that question, as so beautifully illustrated in this report, is to study those laws, to look beyond mere procedural or facial legality to issues like fundamental rights, consistency of approach, and appropriate context. In other words, to distinguish rule of law from rule by law. Thank you.
So Jonathan, thank you. We'll have about 10 or so minutes for Q&A, but also for you to ask Jonathan anything related to either his reading of the report or from his experience at DHS. And we'll take questions both from the in-person audience as well as those online. But if I may, the first question I'd like to ask you is, and I think you made it quite clear in your opening remarks of the differences in how the United States treats what we might view as either secessionist movements or internal problems. I know this is a very complex topic. I'm not saying that necessarily this is the way that China should view Taiwan, or that is the relationship between the two sides. But just from the U.S. perspective, when we see what some may say are these types of organizations or movements, what are the first criteria that we take into account when dealing with these, what some might view as domestic issues?
Yes, well, it's obviously a very complicated question, and of course we at DHS, where I have spent most of at least my executive branch career, are in a different position and take a slightly different approach than, say, the State Department. Our approach is about security, and it's about what is coming into the United States. And so, as I mentioned in my remarks, a lot of what we are focused on is enforcing congressionally enacted laws on restricting products made with forced labor in China and elsewhere, investment, and the like. But stepping back more broadly, I do think we as Americans, and those of us who are lawyers, need to think, as I tried to reflect in my remarks, on law, not just law as facially valid because it's a law, but what was the system that brought it about? What are its provisions? Do they violate higher principles? Do they violate international law? And what is its ultimate validity? And I think that's an important part of it. That's obviously what I spent a lot of time thinking about as I was preparing these remarks this morning.
I know we only have 5 minutes, but really quickly, an example that we keep on hearing from Chinese officials or scholars is the example, okay, so what if Hawaii wanted to secede from the United States? How would we respond to that? Would our approach be the Chinese approach, or what would be the first going in principles in dealing with if we do see a strong, very hypothetical again, a strong movement in Hawaii?
Right, and look, one of the first things I thought about as I began to review this report was what happened in the Civil War, right? States seceded and they were forcibly returned to the Union. We historically think of that as a good thing. How does that differ here? Now, obviously, you can focus on things like slavery, but that's sort of a separate issue from is it permissible, is it legal to secede? So, look, I think an important part of the conversation about that needs to be self-determination, right? So, as happened with the UK and Scotland and Canada and Quebec, an opportunity was given to the group that was considering secession to actually vote on it and self-determine. And, you know, it sort of has happened in the reverse in the United States, too, where at times a lot of thought has been given to, you know, should Puerto Rico be permitted to decide whether it becomes a state, and those sorts of things, and other areas as well. So there definitely has to be an element of self-determination, which is clearly lacking, it seems to me, with Taiwan. Then also the law, to the extent there are laws about it, as we do have in the United States, and as I mentioned in my remarks, they have to respect certain fundamental liberties, right? I didn't mention the word constitution, I think, in my remarks, but obviously I was referencing that when I was talking about fundamental liberties, that, you know, we can pass laws that do certain things up to a point, but we cannot violate those fundamental liberties protected by the Constitution. And I would argue that the approach we should take, whether or not a country has that framed in its Constitution, we should take the approach that fundamental liberties need to be protected. And if they are not, then that reduces or eliminates the validity of any legal action taken in that way.
Thank you. I think we're almost at time, but I did want to make time for one or two questions from the audience, or either in person or online. So if you're in the room and you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay. Yeah, please.
So Bonnie just pointed to one of the Chinese critiques. Another thing that comes up in this space is the U.S. critique, the Taiwanese and U.S. critique of the extraterritorial reach of what China is up to with the Anti-Secession Law, or particularly the 22 articles. And the pushback to the Chinese always is, well, the U.S. do this. You have lots of extraterritorial reach in your law. So where do you get off telling us not to? So sort of what's the sorting principle on legitimate extraterritorial reach with what are, in a sense, political laws and whatnot?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I don't have a perfect answer, but I think one element of it is the process that leads to that law. And it actually takes me back, those of you who studied political philosophy, to a concept in political philosophy, in John Rawls and other, of procedural justice, right? That you can't have perfect justice because no one knows exactly what perfect justice is, but you can approach it by having good process. And so if we have a process that is a good process that leads to a law, that is going to give it a lot more validity than one without. It's not going to automatically ensure it, right? Because we have democratically enacted laws that are then overturned by our Supreme Court. But perhaps you would just add the Supreme Court as another part of that process, that if it goes through a proper process through representational government, procedural protections of fundamental liberties, that is going to give it a lot more legitimacy. Now that, as I say, can't be the complete answer, because sometimes even that can lead to a bad outcome. And there is no question, you know, there's the old saying, I always get the exact wording right from Jonathan Swift, but it's something like foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. That's true. And I can't remember what the word was, foolish. I think it was a different adjective, but the point is the same. That doesn't mean all consistency is bad. In fact, consistency is a good thing. So to the extent, and I haven't studied this as much as many people in the room, but to the extent the United States is being inconsistent in that, we need to think about that and correct it. But I think in all likelihood we are not, because of things like the procedural protections we have, the democratic process that leads to it, and in all likelihood some of the provisions as well that provide more protections than a lot of what some of these other laws like the Chinese laws do.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciated your remarks there. I think Bonnie had raised one point that goes at the heart of the Chinese argument, which is that they do often make the case that how would the United States deal with a secession movement, for example, in Hawaii or in other places? But the truth of the matter is that, I mean, it's simply not comparable in many senses. I mean, the Anti-Secession Law, for the act of secession to take place, implies that Taiwan is currently part of the PRC. And it seeks to succeed out. And that only holds true if two things are consistent. The first is that Taiwan and the international community both recognize the PRC as a successor state to the Republic of China, with the Republic of China being out of existence. And the second part is that the Taiwanese people have no right to self-determination. And both of these are not true. I mean, Taiwan has never been part of the People's Republic of China. They've never exercised sovereignty over Taiwan. So I think the uniqueness of the Anti-Secession Law actually quite reflects the uniqueness of the cross-strait situation. I'm curious, though, to hear your thoughts. I mean, it's in a sense extraterritorial in a way that it's applying anti-secession to a place that is not part of this country.
Right.
I mean, is there any similar cases that we've seen anywhere in the world where we see similarity or likeness to this current situation? And how has the United States dealt with it or reacted legally to such a framework?
Yeah, well, I think, and I'm sure others have other ideas in mind, but because it's so much at the forefront of people's minds today, and I mentioned it in my remarks, Ukraine is an interesting example to look at, because I don't think it's the only, but one of the justifications Russia provides for its invasion of Ukraine is that Ukraine is not really a separate country. It's always been part of Russia. And yeah, well, look at how the United States has responded to that, very harshly. Some would argue not as strongly as it perhaps should have, but clearly quite strongly supporting Ukraine and rejecting that narrative, in part because it is historically inaccurate, but in part also because it is simply inappropriate. Even if, let's say, a long time ago, and look, there have been times when Ukraine was certainly part of the Soviet Union, and it was part of Russia. The territory changed hands a lot in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in that part of Europe. But the fact that it has been an independent country for quite some time now, that it has been accepted by the world community, and any number of other differences that Ukraine and Russia specialists can spell out much better than I can, I think is determinative there. And there are a lot of parallels to what is happening with China and Taiwan. And now, as you point out yourself, each situation is a little different always, so it is hard to draw these generalities, right? But there are certain principles that I think we need to be consistent on and to adhere to.
Great, thank you, Vincent. And I think just to highlight, I don't think we're trying to take a position here, but we're trying to make the most difficult case, even if you assume that the Chinese position is correct. As Jonathan and others have made clear, the anti-secession law does not have very legal merits. But again, it's much more complex than that, and I hope that we will use the panel to dive into this. But really excellent questions, as well as, Jonathan, you anticipating all of this, both in your opening remarks, but also questions mentioning how the United States and other countries deal with this, but also the Ukraine example. Right. So, Jonathan, really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you very much for reviewing our report.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. It really has been a pleasure for me and educational as well. So thank you.
Take a short 5-minute break. Okay, great. We're going to get started, and our apologies for our online audience. We are a bit delayed compared to what we originally intended, but I'm very delighted to be joined by this excellent panel of leading U.S. and Taiwan experts on this issue. Let me first introduce my co-conspirator, Dr. Yizhong Lai, sitting at the other end, who will also be moderating this panel with me. Dr. Lai is the president of the Prospect Foundation and board member of Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. He served as Director General for the Department of International Affairs, Director General for the Department of China Affairs, in the Democratic Progressive Party. And prior to that, he was Special Assistant for Policy to Taiwan Representative to Japan, Executive Director for the DPP Mission in the United States, and Vice President of the Taiwan think tank. He received his PhD from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University and was a visiting researcher at Cornell University. Before turning the floor to Dr. Lai, let me also introduce the other panelists and experts who will be speaking. To my left, and really, I would probably thank Vincent for encouraging us to engage in this effort, and as well as his guidance along the way. Vincent is a Taipei City Council member and former director of the political division at the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States. He previously served as the chief of staff to Taiwan's foreign minister in senior level positions at the Office of the President and National Security Council. Prior to joining Taiwan's government, he was deputy director of the International Affairs Department in the Democratic Progressive Party and played a significant role in President Tsai Ing-wen's successful presidential election bid in 2016. Next to Vincent is Professor Jacques Delisle. He is the Stephen A. Kozin Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, Chair of the Asia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Director of the Center for Study of Contemporary China, and Co-Director of the Center for Asian Law. He has lots of titles and he's very in demand, so we're very grateful that I think he's on his third week of travel that he's able to join us. He also serves as a member of the board of the Institute and on the editorial board of Orbis, the Institute's journal. He specialized in government and law in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and has authored and co-authored several books on these topics. His writing has appeared in journals and periodicals, and he has a BA from Princeton University in Public International Affairs, a JD from Harvard Law School, and received graduate education at the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Next to Jacques is Professor Julien Koo. He's visiting professor of law at Columbia Law University, and Maurice A. Dean Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law at the Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University. He specializes in the relationship between U.S. and international laws. In 2012, he co-authored Taming Globalization, International Law, the U.S. Constitution, and the New World Order, along with John Yoo. He has served as a law clerk to the Honorable Jerry E. Smith of the U.S. Courts of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, an Olin Fellow, a lecturer in law at the University of Virginia Law School, and a visiting professor at College of William at Mary Marshall White School of Law. He was a associate attorney specializing in international disputes at the New York City law firm, as well as he has been a Fulbright distinguished lecturer in law at the East China University and a Taiwan Fellow at National Taiwan University. Lots of very distinguished positions as well as roles. And last but not least, I think probably very familiar to our audiences in DC is the Honorable Randy Schreiber. He is founder and chairman of Project 2049, Institute Commissioner of the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, and partner at Pacific Solutions. He has previously been the Institute's president and CEO, and he spent many years with the United States government. He previously served in the Department of Defense as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, where he was my boss, and worked with the Office of the Secretary of Defense as the senior official responsible for managing bilateral U.S. relations with militaries of China and Taiwan. Prior to his role as the Assistant Secretary, he was a founding partner of Armitage International, a consulting firm for international business development. He also served in the Department of State as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs and Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor to the Deputy Secretary of State. So an incredibly distinguished panel here to share with us their thoughts and their perspectives on the anti-secession law and 22 articles. So with that, let me turn the floor to my co-moderator and partner, Dr. Yizhong Lai.
Thank you, Bunny. First, I'd just like to say that the Prospect Foundation is very pleased to work with CSIS on this report. It's a timely report. And actually, it is the Bunny and the CSIS wonderful staff that did all the work. Prospect Foundation, including me, we just sort of take advantage of this. So any praise and the highlights about this report, I think CSI should take all the credit. And then I will just return to my the role as the co-moderator here. The first question I'd like to ask my fellow Taiwanese, Vincent Chow from the Taipei City Council, is that we know next year is going to be the 20th anniversary of the anti-secession law, the passage. But then the anti-secession law was passed during the Hu Jintao period. And now we're in a very different leadership of Xi Jinping. And we also know this year that Xi Jinping, under his leadership, there's 22 articles about the opinion anti-Taiwan independence, but that's basically work on the individuals. So would you like to describe to us the context about the anti-secession law that was passed in year 2005, and also its relationship with the 22 articles earlier this year? And basically just also give a brief review, overview of this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lai, and thank you. I'm especially grateful to Bonnie Lin because Bonnie is not only the brains, but she's also the muscle behind this report. And her team has done a wonderful job of putting this report together from a series of disparate articles that people have written and stringing them together in a cohesive, I think, train of thought that clearly outlines not only the challenges, difficulties, but also opportunities we see as we deal with the anti-secession law. And make no mistake, this is an important piece of legislation. Just a few days ago, we saw the Chinese engage in the second part of their joint sword exercises, and that was seen as a response to President Lai Ching-te's May 10/10 National Day address. The Joint Sword B exercises spanned one day. They engaged in a series of naval and air exercises that were aimed at not only surrounding but potentially blockading Taiwan. But despite these overt military actions, what goes on behind the hood is equally as important. And as PLA naval ships and airplanes buzz around Taiwan's vicinity, we know that their desire to annex Taiwan is clear, not only from a military component, but also from a legal framework. And today, we're very pleased to be here to explore that legal framework. Now, I'll claim no credit for basically shamelessly plagiarizing what a series of my fellow panelists have written in this report. And so I'll start with plagiarizing I'm butchering your name. Jack's report, which is this. In 2003, the PLA passed a 3 warfares framework in terms of its regulations on the political work of the Chinese PLA. The 3 warfares are this. Number 1, 舆论战, the public opinion warfare. Number 2, 心理战, psychological warfare. And the third, and the most prominent example of this is the 法律战, which is legal warfare, which we term as lawfare. The use of lawfare, this is actually something I've been thinking about on the way here. It's actually a brand new word. I mean, this word didn't come into existence until just a few, I think, years ago, at least in terms of popular usage. The dictionary defines it, the Cambridge Dictionary defines it as the use of legal action cause problems for an opponent. Now, in terms of problems, I think the Chinese have been clear that they're using this the use of lawfare is directed against their views of not only curbing so-called Taiwanese succession, but also affecting Taiwanese potential annexation. Now, Dr. Lai had asked a few questions. How did the ASL come into being? So number two, I'll plagiarize Bonnie's work. So Bonnie was very clear in her article that this was introduced by Hu Jintao in 2005 for a couple of reasons. The first, and probably the most foremost, was the response to former President Chen Shui-bian's re-election in 2004, and a need to be seen as strong and as being able to take action on Taiwan. That was Hu Jintao's rationale in 2005. The anti-secession law was based actually on a scholar, a Chinese scholar, that had written something similar about 3 years prior in terms of introducing a framework that would not only cover the political means for unification, but also the benefits of doing so, the criminal actions against it, and so forth. And this scholar's work was later adopted, I think, by Wen Jiabao in 2004, by him referring to this as an ideal framework and something they wanted to make progress on. And this later culminated in the anti-secession law in 2005. Now, the end result of the anti-secession law in 2005 contained 10 articles. But of the 10 articles, 2 are perhaps the most important for our context here. The first one is Article 2 on sovereignty. The second one is Article 8 on non-peaceful means. Now, I put this in my own article within this report that I believe that there is a strong possibility that Xi Jinping will weaponize both components as time goes by, particularly next year, as we see the 20th anniversary of the anti-secession law come into play. 4 years ago, during the 15th anniversary, the Chinese state-owned media had already published an article stating that they should further revise the anti-secession law in light of new challenges coming from the US-China relationship. Now, there is expectation, I think, that, again, in 2025, as the 20th anniversary approaches, that another look could be taken at the ASL to further reinforce these 2 articles and to give it more meat, so to say. Article 2 on sovereignty is actually very interesting because although it doesn't point necessarily to the point, to a part that Taiwan is a part of the PRC, it says China. But it does state very unequivocally that, that this is based on the One China principle. And the Taiwan Affairs Office, together with the PRC Constitution, has long defined the One China principle to be based on Taiwan being part of China and the PRC being exercising sovereignty over the entire China, and by extension, Taiwan being part of the PRC. So while the Article 2 as it currently stands is not very clear in terms of Taiwan's political status as part of the PRC, there is a possibility that it can be interpreted going forward as making that more clear. Article 8, of course, is the more problematic one because it lays out a series of conditions in which the Chinese state could employ non-peaceful means. It authorizes the Central Military Commission as well as other decision-making bodies to make that determination in terms of when non-peaceful means may be employed and how it may be utilized. Now, I say to start that we believe that a further weaponization of the anti-secession law is not only possible, but likely. And the main reason is this. Xi Jinping has already interpreted the anti-secession law in a way that none of his successors have in the past. And that brings me to the final point that Dr. Lai had made, which was on the 22 articles. The 22 articles was released in May 26, 2024, this year, during a joint press conference together by SPC, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Public Security, and the Ministry of State Security. The document is formally called Opinions on Punishing Crimes of Separatism and Citing Separatism by Taiwanese Independence Diehards in Accordance with Law. Now, this is something that has added teeth to the ASL, which was cited thoroughly during that press conference. And the point that was made clearly was that the ASL is not something symbolic, but also something substantive in terms of providing for punishments, including the possibility of death for people that they deem to be ardent supporters of so-called Taiwanese independence. And as a result, we see this as a trend that the current PRC Xi Jinping leadership is engaged on, which is to give teeth to formerly pieces of legislation that had seemed more benign in the case of the anti-secession law. And so I think 2025 is a year we should certainly keep a lookout for And we hope and expect that our friends from around the world will continue to show concern over the use of Chinese lawfare against Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Vincent, for your remarks. And when you mentioned about 22 articles, it just brought up to the issue that Robert Cao, who's supposed to be here today, but for some reason he can't. Just yesterday or the day before that, he has been announced to be on the Taiwan Independent Separatist list by China. So that automatically means that he probably will be under the 22 articles prosecutions by China. And welcome him to join the list that I already in since last year. Next question I'd like to direct to Professor Jackie Lyle is that this the anti-secession law, just as the Vincent Zhao mentioned in Article 2, laid out the Chinese position that both sides is not separated, although not yet unified. And that has become the Chinese persistent positions regarding Taiwan written in the law. And then we also noticed that in the last several years, China also put its definition about the Resolution 2750 of the United Nations into its policy toward Taiwan. I think it was released in the report a couple of years ago. And then this year we saw this 22 articles. So in terms of the legal perspective, the 22 article, apparently that's on the individuals, but anti-secession law at that time when it was announced is basically work on the state, the collective entities. So how would you like to see that those different operating factors that had this legal implication, as well as how the anti-secession law, in terms of how the Chinese action in the United Nations, the relationship between those two? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lai Yidong. I think, Yidong, you pointed to the three sort of components of Chinese lawfare on this issue, the addressing Taiwan's international status through the UN and General Assembly Resolution 2758. That's one speaks directly at the international level. The anti-secession law speaks ostensibly domestically, but clearly has an international focus. And the 22 articles are framed even more as a domestic measure, but as I'll say later, they have extraterritorial reach, not just in Taiwan, but beyond. So in a way, the anti-secession law is a little bit of a puzzle because it doesn't really do very much. That is, the substance of what's in it was familiar. The Chinese positions were already set forth in the two white papers, including the then recent 2000 white paper. And it is a law that doesn't empower the state, as we heard earlier today, it doesn't empower the Chinese state or the Chinese military to do anything it couldn't do already. It doesn't need the anti-secession law to use non-peaceful means. And conversely, the law doesn't meaningfully restrain state or military action. Nobody seriously thinks that anything even more restrictive in the anti-secession law would, when push comes to shove, restrict leadership choices. But all it does is put in a very thin procedure which says the Chinese Military Commission, Central Military Commission, and the State Council reporting to the National People's Congress get to do this. That's not a great restraint. And the 22 articles is framed as not making new law. It's a mere interpretation of the anti-secession law, Chinese criminal and criminal procedure law. So why bother? And I think our opening keynote got into some of this. Part of it is this is a specifically legal tool that is targeted at what China sees as unacceptably pro-independence moves by Taiwan. And it is often targeting where those pro-independence moves have a legal component to them. So it's sort of tit for tat in that regard. And this is an old thing in the reform era Chinese toolkit. If you put something in a formal national law, it signals importance, it signals seriousness, it signals perhaps a degree of permanence. But it's also, I think, an attempt to tap into law's legitimacy. To some degree, the regime has invested a lot in China, saying we take law seriously, so if we put something in law, take it seriously. But it also speaks to the audiences in Taiwan and the US and elsewhere, which take legal means seriously. It's putting this at least in the form of legality, and therefore putting some legitimacy on it. But again, as I said, it's also part of a tit for tat. So if you look at the anti-secession law itself, it came in the wake of Chen Shui-bian doing things that looked kind of law-ish. Constitutional reform, referenda, both of which are associated with independence. You saw a re-emphasis on the anti-secession law under Tsai Ing-wen, and China made a big deal out of her rather modest and not very assertive attempt at constitutional reform. Again, it was law against law in that regard. And you see with Lai Ching-te coming to power, pushback as well. And Lai echoed Tsai's international law resident claims about Taiwan's independent sovereign state status. Lai added the little filigree that said under international law, which even hit that harder. And so China pushes back in kind. And so what you see is basically using this legal tool in that way. And indeed, if you look at the 22 articles, one of the things it criminalizes is referenda or lawmaking to change Taiwan's constitution or legal status. So it's in that space. Secondly, the anti-secession law reflects and supports China's sort of master narrative on Taiwan's status. And here it dovetails with the 2758 arguments that basically says Taiwan is currently part of China, and therefore Taiwanese people are Chinese nationals. And that the status quo is that. So even if Taiwan can go and tick all the boxes of what it takes to be a state in the international system, separate territory, population, its own government, the capacity to engage in at least informal international relations, that's not enough. Taiwan would have to clear the much higher threshold of seceding from an existing state. And of course, if you think that Taiwan has not yet separated, China has a relatively free hand. I mean, think of what goes on here. A unification law, which was considered, sounds more aggressive, and indeed it does perhaps telegraph an urgency to rectify the situation. But in a way, the anti-secession law is conceptually more assertive. It says it hasn't even gotten away yet, and so we're just going to prevent that. That's all kind of legal hair-splitting, perhaps, but it has political significance. Even if you think that law, and I think rightly, law is not going to constrain what Taiwan or China or the US does under really dire circumstances, nonetheless, it moves the political boundary, right? That is, if China's narrative is accepted, then China can use force domestically against Taiwan, because it is domestic. It's like putting down a rebellion or a secessionist movement or a civil war that isn't over yet. And US intervention, certainly forcibly, then becomes an attack, an intervention in Chinese territory against its sovereignty and its autonomy, and it becomes fomenting secession. Whereas if you buy the increasingly prevalent, increasingly openly stated Taiwanese argument that this is a separate sovereign entity, then China's use of coercion becomes an international use of force, a violation of Taiwan's autonomy and integrity. So a lot does kind of turn on that framing. And this dovetails with 2758, where China recently, and this came very prominent in the 2022 white paper, says that settled once and for all the question of Taiwan's international legal status. It put it inside China. The world now recognizes this. China even claims this is a principle of international law binding on everyone. That's the sort of international law-facing version of the same story. I've beaten that one to death in a report if anybody's interested. Thirdly, the anti-secession law has remained vital for China's approach, in part because it has been so vague and therefore so flexible. For a long time, it worked perfectly well with a strategy of peaceful development, an approach that said China could tolerate separation de facto for some period as long as no formal lines were crossed in declaring independence. But it's also been compatible without any kind of amendment with a much tougher line, and that's what we've seen, and that's where Vincent points to the risk of weaponization. And the 22 articles are intentionally framed, I think, as not doing anything new. Right, they're framed as a mere interpretation of existing law and not a major move, but clearly they are substantively tougher. So in that sense, I think we can expect the ASL to continue to be fairly important and to serve the purposes that Chinese policy decides that it's going to be put to. But I would suggest that its role is changing, and the 22 articles are an indication of that change in role, because what China is worried about on Taiwan has changed. Its bad case scenarios are not what they were in 2005. The notion that Chen Shui-bian would stand up and say the Republic of Taiwan hereby is declared, you're not going to get that. And so it's much more a concern with gradual or creeping independence. And the 22 articles target that sort of thing. Are you advocating in education, history, or the media a movement towards secession or independence? Are you suppressing pro-unification views? Are you engaging in other, that catch-all phrase, conduct? It's meant to chill. And it is no longer targeting Taiwan as a political entity or a state. It's targeting individuals and organizations. Yes, many of those individuals are DPP leaders who hold government positions, but it's much broader than that. It's getting into the heads and as we heard earlier today, the thoughts, the speech made by people who have what China considers unacceptably pro-independence viewpoints. Another concern that China has increasingly focused on is the so-called internationalization of the Taiwan question, making it less a cross-Strait bilateral matter or a trilateral if you include the US, and instead a concern with Taiwan gaining sort of international context and contacts. So the 22 articles specifically go beyond the ASL's kind of rote, don't interfere in Chinese internal affairs if you're a foreign actor, but rather we now see things about criminalizing support for Taiwan entering international organizations, at least those that require statehood as a membership, promoting formal military or official ties and exchanges, as well as the old no one China, one Taiwan, no two China policy promotion. And we see enhanced punishment under the 22 articles for any of the bad acts that are undertaken in collaboration with foreign forces. This echoes what we saw with the Hong Kong National Security Law as well. And finally, when we see China doing things like these military exercises, including the very recent ones, we're up to B, we'll be C, I think we'll see C and D later in the year, perhaps. Right, would bet against it. But there is this sense that when China, does these things, it doesn't want to invoke the anti-secession law. It doesn't want to say this is getting real close to non-peaceful means, which would provoke pushback. But instead, we increasingly see China's moves framed as mere enforcement of domestic laws. So the military exercises, at least you don't invoke the anti-secession law for non-peaceful means. You don't put it in that bucket, even though some more hawkish types in China want to do that. But we see things as like China's just enforcing its own maritime laws when it sends the Coast Guard and non-military ships in to exercise control of waters off Taiwan. Or where we see not just those gray zone tactics, but also these claims that the 22 articles are just going after individuals, right? It's just enforcing Chinese domestic criminal law against bad elements who in the Chinese view are Chinese. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. I think I just give the floor to my co-moderator, Bonnie. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lai. I do want to turn the floor now to Julian. I know I guess a good portion of your assessment was already referenced by Jonathan and others already, but I know you spent quite a bit of time looking at the anti-secession law as well as 22 articles with a focus looking at the international implications, but also how other countries, including the United States, have dealt with similar situations. So I wanted to turn to you to share your thoughts on both your assessment, but also to add on to any of the assessments and views that Vincent and Jacques have already shared.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And thanks, this is for the opportunity to share my kind of a little bit unconventional views on some of these topics. So, yeah, I guess what I was struck by, this conversation we're having as, especially the reference to lawfare, which is a term, where does that term come from? The Chinese have adopted it, but it has, it's sort of used in a variety of different contexts. Lawyers are actually not that comfortable with lawfare because law is supposed to be something you can actually use in a regularized way, but if you use it as a political tactic, it's a little bit harder for us to sort of handle. And yet, I think that's a lot of this conversation about how law is being used to advance political goals, I think is exactly what's going on here. And so we need to, as lawyers or other people, think about law in a sort of a strategic way or in ways other than just sort of how it's applied in practice. And so this project in my little essay here was really an attempt to sort of use, to place into context China's anti-secession law and compare it. It's really a comparative law project. In other words, compare China's anti-secession law to other countries' laws governing secession. China's not the only country in the world that is dealing with secession. And I thought that's a really useful way to think about it because what I was struck by when we were looking at this is that China's defense of the anti-secession law and then the 22 articles is that this is just what any country would do, right? What China is doing with the anti-secession law is common practice of all countries in the world who want to, that all of them would do exactly what we're doing, nothing to see here, totally normal. And I think what I think is important to push back on is to make the point that's not true. Even if you live in sort of China's alternate universe, there's kind of like for those of you who are a fan of Marvel movies, you always get stuck in like a different universe depending on weird things that happen when you touch or go through strange rings or something, and then like everything's different. Don't make me go through everything here. So imagine there are two universes. There's the universe, China's legal universe, where Taiwan's a part of China. Everyone agrees that, according to them, that's the world. And then in that case, anti-secession law is a normal practice. And then there's the rest of the world, or at least most of the rest of the world, where Taiwan is already a sovereign state, or its final status is undetermined, but it's not any, it's a successor state to China. There's these two universes, and one of the problems is that China just kind of lives in its own universe, and it just keeps talking as if the other rest of the world doesn't exist. So I think this project is to take China on, even if you're trapped in China's legal universe, you can still have arguments to criticize and criticize the consistency or the reasonableness of China's own sort of position. So I think, and so what I was trying to assess here, and I think Mr. Meyer kindly references that even if Taiwan is part of China, which a lot of the world, most of the world doesn't accept, but even if it was, it doesn't make sense that you would have an anti-secession law. It's not reasonable or legitimate, in my view, to have an anti-secession law that essentially criminalizes everyday action, speech, as Mr. Meyer mentioned, or hanging out with people who might be people who support Taiwan joining an international organization. This is not a normal way. This is not the way countries today, even countries facing serious secessionist movements, deal with this problem, right? So, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. So, it's just like it's not normal for, even if Ukraine was somehow part of Russia, it's not normal to like invade and kill everyone there. It's not normal to say, okay, well, even if you just kind of think about post online, literally online or something, or on, if you happen to, or post on Twitter, hey, I think Taiwan should be a member of the World Health Organization. It's not normal to say, okay, violation of Chinese criminal law, we're coming, if you ever come to China, or even if you don't, we're going to arrest you and charge you with secession or sedition. If you look at the way other countries, even countries that are facing like Azerbaijan or other countries, this is not a normal way. Most countries in the world today, the trend is definitely to treat secession movements very lightly, and to respect the right of free expression and the other fundamental liberties, and so to only sort of criminalize or punish actions that threaten the use of violence or force. And that's the approach taken in most of Europe, in Central Asia, in many countries like Azerbaijan. It's also the approach taken here in the United States. Now, some of you may say, the Civil War. But actually, interestingly, since the Civil War, the United States has really, or even during the Civil War, there was a lot of questions about whether secession itself was a crime. Whether it was legal was another question, but the whole argument of the Civil War was that the South was using force to secede because they took all of the U.S. Army facilities or surrounded them. And that was the justification to use force. It wasn't just you can't leave, and so therefore we get to invade and conquer you. And so, it's reflected even in U.S. practice today. The U.S. has always limited itself with respect to secessionist movements to punishments for violence or the use of force. Now, there is actually really a Hawaiian independence movement. It's not very, aggressive, but when I lived in Hawaii, I did notice that there are some people. But you can walk around all day long in Hawaii and say Hawaii should be independent. In fact, there are people in Hawaii who argue Hawaii is already independent. This is kind of a weird argument, but some of you in Taiwan might be familiar with this idea. And so therefore, we don't need to do anything. We're already independent. None of that is illegal. None of that violates U.S. law. All of those rights to say those things are protected by the free speech clause of the U.S. Constitution. I think that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate. It's a civilized way to deal with this. And part of the idea is that if you really wanted to leave, you could have a vote. And in fact, with respect to Puerto Rico, this is a good example. They've had 6 votes. The United States has allowed Puerto Rico to vote again and again and again on whether it wants to be independent, whether it wants to maintain its status quo, which is a non-state commonwealth, or whether it wants to join the United States as the 51st state. This has happened 6 different times throughout U.S. history. In other words, the United States has, again, not perfectly, but has certainly a lot more than China is willing to do, respected the right of Puerto Rico to have self-determination, and has given the people a free and fair vote to make that decision, and has not punished anyone in Puerto Rico who says, actually, we'd like Puerto Rico to be independent. Now, There have been Puerto Rican terrorists in the past, several of whom tried to kill President Truman. Those people were punished. Why? Because they tried to kill President Truman, not because they advocated for Puerto Rico independence. And I think there's a big difference there. And I think if you place China's sort of paranoia about anti-secession into context, I think it's a sign that China is not confident it can persuade people in Taiwan that it would be better if we were all together in one political entity. Instead of saying, you know what, let's talk about it, let's try to have a conversation, let's think about the ways it would be better if we're together. It's like, if you even think about leaving, I'm going to come beat you up, right? Or do worse. And I think that's a sign, not of strength, but of weakness. And I think that's, if you place the anti-secession law in that context, even if you live in the world where Taiwan is already part of China somehow, and you want unification, it's a sign of really a weakness and insecurity that China cannot actually be countered to persuade people that this is actually what is good for Taiwan, but can only force you at the point of military exercises and the gun to force you. And I think that's the real thing to keep in mind as you push back against, one way to push back on, I think, what the anti-secession law represents.
Thank you very much, Julian. I think there's a lot that I want to follow up on, but I do want to give the floor to Randy first before we open up for Q&A and discussion. I want to flag that I think Randy has a very unique perspective on this, because if I remember correctly, you were in the government when the anti-secession law was passed, and you were also asked to testify in front of Congress on this. So you are representing the U.S. position now, but now you are out of government, and perhaps you can speak more freely. And it's also almost 20 years past that we have a different China, we have a different U.S.-China relationship. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what are the implications of the anti-secession law now for the United States and our allies and partners, and from your perspective, how should we respond, and what should we be doing?
Well, thank you, Bonnie, and congratulations to CSIS and Prospect for this report and the contributing authors. I enjoyed the report, enjoyed the comments earlier on the panel. Yeah, thanks for the trip down memory lane. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia at the time, and in fact, that was one of my final acts. I resigned effective May 1st of that year, so I think the testimony was in April. And I think, I wouldn't say it's a matter of I wasn't as free to speak then, I'm freer to speak now. I do think, thinking back on those remarks, that we might have misfired just a little bit, and I think there was context for that. You know, it's when you look with the benefit of history and experience, you can critique just about anything. But you know, at the time, I think we really focused on the anti-secession law as being provocative and as a hardening of their position, which they'd already taken, as was pointed out earlier. And so we really sort of focused on the response to Chen Shui-bian's re-election, the referendums, and this is a provocation of sorts. But the mindset at the time was we were certainly worried about provocations from both sides. And so I think that very much informed our response at the time. And I think the other thing is, you know, from the framework of deterrence, I think what we missed was, you know, the deterrence comes through the capability, the intent, and the credibility. And I think what the Chinese did with the anti-secession law is they really strengthened the credibility of their willingness to use force with what was sort of framed as a hand-tying, you know, legal framework, right? It's sort of like, if you know the movie Dr. Strangelove, you know, had they actually shared with the other side the doomsday machine, it would have been the ultimate deterrent, right? Because it's the ultimate hand-tying mechanism, right? And so I think what this has allowed the Chinese to say is, you know, there are certain things that Taiwan could do, or U.S. or other foreign interference could do that would essentially force our hand into military action. Now, that's in a context where our own deterrence has been a combination of ambiguity and the dual deterrence we're trying to achieve from that, and some comfort in a qualitative military advantage. So if you fast forward, what we have now in this deterrence framework is greater and greater clarity from the Chinese side, I would argue greater and greater credibility from the Chinese side, are clinging to ambiguity. And an honest person can say that's still the right framework because dual deterrence is still important, but nonetheless, you don't strengthen credibility by remaining ambiguous, right? You have a credibility issue there just inherently. But that military gap in terms of a qualitative advantage has closed dramatically. And so I think for the U.S., I look at it, maybe it's my DoD experience, I look at it through this deterrence framework and how this is additive to the Chinese side in terms of trying to deter potential moves towards independence, deter U.S. support, other support. And so I think that's a really important element here. I think the other thing is this question of lawfare, which is really important. And Julian, your comment about that U.S. Legal scholars, legal community are a bit uncomfortable with it. I think we have to get a little more comfortable with it because, what you see, not only the anti-secession law, but that's part of a more comprehensive lawfare approach, which is really squeezing Taiwan in very significant ways. And we don't have to adopt the position of a country, what was the expression, rule by law, not rule of law, but rule by law. We can just talk about our own laws, which actually, if you read the Taiwan Relations Act, there's parts of it that we're all familiar with, weapons of a defensive character for sufficient self-defense and maintain the capacity to resist force, and we all sort of know that part. There's an extensive part of it which talks about, in the absence of diplomatic relations and an ambiguous position on ultimate sovereignty, how we look at Taiwan and their legal status and things that they essentially are expected to do and how we interact with them that essentially mirrors a sovereign entity, because one of the major points of the Taiwan Relations Act was to continue normal trade and to continue people-to-people ties and all the agreements that we had in place, for example, legal agreements between the ROC and the United States was essentially sustained through the Taiwan Relations Act in this new era of non-diplomatic relations. So we only need to talk about our own law, and this is going to become increasingly important because, if there's a fisherman, fishing vessel in distress, whose Coast Guard has the right to come and help the fisherman, help the vessel, and we're going to get pressed on this quite a bit. And a reasonable interpretation of our own law is Taiwan has the right to do that, and we should articulate that, I think, more and more, and provide a real counterweight to the lawfare that is really going on unchecked. I mean, our basic response to the lawfare is, that's provocative, we don't like it. We don't say, actually, our interpretation of our own law suggests that Taiwan has the right, the legal right, to do these various things that mere actions that a sovereign would take. The last point I guess I'll make is this is increasingly important not only as sort of a counter to what the Chinese are doing in the lawfare space and in the more comprehensive efforts to coerce and pressure Taiwan. It's this international piece that several people have mentioned. There are many countries that are concerned about China's ambitions and assertive behavior, and we're seeing things in the defense and security space that I think are a result of that, things in the Philippines, things in Japan. There's still that gap of what does this mean for the defense of Taiwan, the security of Taiwan, and for us to close that gap, in my opinion, we also have to have a strong legal counter-argument to what China's doing in the lawfare space. Because ultimately, Ukraine was mentioned, I think, several times this morning, and appropriately so. But for many countries, the legal distinction would be the operative distinction when it comes to, are we going to help Taiwan or not? Well, no, they're not a member of the United Nations. Many of our allies place a premium on standing in the UN. Does international law support our involvement in the protection of Taiwan? Does our own domestic law support it? Because other countries don't have a version of the Taiwan Relations Act. It's all pretty ad hoc in terms of decisions they made at the time of suspending relations with the ROC and forming diplomatic relations with the PRC. So our willingness to engage more and more in this legal space, if only to articulate the interpretation of our own laws, I think will help with that international piece too, because if something happens in the near term here, most countries will want some assessment of the international standing of the actions they're going to take, and this is far different than the situation in Ukraine from that perspective.
Thank you very much, Randy. I think your recommendations on that we should do a lot more, including providing our own interpretations, international law, but also really pushing back a lot more on the lawfare side. It's been quite striking to me, just as we're engaging with all these top scholars looking at the anti-secession law, of how little governments have officially pushed back on the anti-secession law. I think aside from 2005, right around the time when you were briefing Congress, I don't think there's been any statements on the anti-secession law by any government since then. And it's shocking to me because given all that we outlined, right, there's just much more, there's no reason why we shouldn't be pushing back from the US government's perspective, as well as pushing back publicly on this. But I do want to make sure I leave enough time for Q&A, but also to bring more folks into the conversation. If I don't mind, and Dr. Lai, I'll turn to you also for any final questions you have for the panel. But one question I do have for perhaps our Taiwan friends, since we have a number of our US scholars saying what the United States should do, is what do you think the United States and also our allies and partners can do to help Taiwan more from this perspective? Maybe I'll start with you, Vincent, and then turn to Dr. Lai.
That's a very good question. I don't think it's something we've thought a lot about in the past because our efforts have always been focused more on the security, international space, and economic realm. But certainly the lawfare realm is something that we should give increasing attention to. Now, I think the point is this. In terms of what the United States and the international community can do, I think it's to call the ASL out for what it is. Number one, it's a fundamentally destabilizing piece of legislation. So if, for example, we have hopes that cross-strait relations can return to the status quo, that China can continue to play a responsible role in the region, then the ASL is fundamentally in contravention of that. I mean, the ASL, by definition, rules out the perpetual continuation of the status quo. Like the ASL provides a necessity for there to be ongoing action towards so-called unification for the ASL to be satisfied. And as a result, it is important, therefore, to recognize that the ASL is in contravention of the cross-strait status quo, and that responsibility must be, and that China is primarily responsible for that. The second part, I think, is to be very concerned and watchful for further attempts to interpret ASL in a way that would be negative towards cross-strait peace and stability. And I think my fellow panelists have pointed out quite strongly the fact that, well, the 22 articles, they're not a new piece of legislation. They're a rereading of the ASL and what the ASL allows under the current framework. Another colleague that has worked on this for a long time, Maggie Lewis, has actually researched a number of court cases within China that actually have cited ASL as penalizing, for example, the freedom of speech or terminology or symbolism within China itself in terms of references to Taiwan. And so therefore, I think we have to be careful that what the ASL provides is an ambiguous framework that can be further interpreted and defined in a way that would, I think, cause further difficulties and challenges within the cross-strait context. And I think we should continue to watch out for that and to call it out. Now, I've said in my remarks that I think next year, during the 20th anniversary, I mean, the PRC, they're a big fan of anniversaries. They love anniversaries. I mean, every anniversary, there's always something. 40周年这个对台同胞的这个 the 40th anniversary of Letter to Taiwan Compatriots and stuff. I mean, every time there's a major anniversary, I think the PRC has used these opportunities to further enunciate actions against Taiwan, and particularly in detriment of cross-strait relations. And so next year, I think, is a year that we would have to be especially concerned about in terms of what other interpretations can be made under the current ASO framework that would be further destabilizing for the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I will say that the 20 years after the passage of Anti-Secession Law, I will say that in the past, in year 2005, where I was in Taiwan, a lot of focus actually is on the Article 8, about how that the law will authorize the Chinese to use force against Taiwan. But also, as just Jack Delisle just mentioned, if you look at the Chinese recent action against Taiwan, very much focused on increase and intensify the gray zone operations. Instead of the citing the article that authorized China to use force against Taiwan, it's actually doing it as if the Taiwan does not exist. So everything that Taiwan has is under the Chinese jurisdiction, and they are operating as if though that the Chinese own those places. And so the interesting development about anti-secession law exercises, especially we see in the last several years, is that they emphasize more and more about how Taiwan is already part of China, as mentioned in the Article 2 of anti-secession law. And they codified it into the Chinese domestic law so that they could penalize Taiwanese people or anyone, the foreigners, to advocate or to support the Taiwanese are not part of China, and will be prosecuted by those domestic law under the 22 articles. And I think when we talk about the lawfare by China, the kind of the development we should think about, this is the situation we're dealing with. So probably a lot of focus. Right now, we also need to deal with how the Article 2 of the Anti-Secession Law itself, especially in terms of international effects, that could, we need to prevent the legitimization and strengthening of those arguments internationally, so that the fundamental argument of the Anti-Secession Law will not be able to hold up. And in that regard, I will say that in addition to the attention to Chinese possible use force against Taiwan, it will be that the important thing is how to make the Taiwan not part of PRC as an international consensus. I think to Taiwan defense as well as Taiwan's international standing, this is very, very important. And that also brings up how the fight against the Chinese distortion about the UN Resolution 2758 right now onto the surface. That battle needs to broaden and strengthen. Right now, we already see some of development within the United States, but we need to make that as part of the G7 consensus, just as the Taiwan Strait security and stability, as well as Taiwan international participations. And then from that, we need to get our democratic friends consensus support as well, because that will be the fundamental way to challenge and at least to delegitimize Chinese assertion that its position on Taiwan is supported not just by its friends, but also within the United Nations. And we need to prevent that from happening, to destroy the legalization and the fundamental legitimacy of any possible use of Chinese force against Taiwan.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lai. With that, I think we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A from both folks in the room, but also online. So if you have any questions in the room, please raise your hand and we will provide you with the microphone. Okay. Then are there questions online, please, Brian?
Yeah, one of the questions is about whether there are contradictions between, I guess this goes to any panelists, but Randy, maybe specifically for you, since you mentioned the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act. Does the use of U.S. domestic law as kind of the rationale behind U.S. actions make it harder to push back against China for using its domestic actions and laws when it comes to Taiwan? Is there any contradiction there in terms of how China can use U.S. efforts on that front to push back against us?
Well, I've certainly heard that argument. I think, the comments earlier today about the legitimacy of law through process, all of that probably applies. But I think from, a non-legal but policy perspective, you have to take into account the unique circumstances of the switch of diplomatic relations at the time and our efforts to keep normal trade and people-to-people ties. It also really underscored emerging international norms with respect to a country with which you didn't have formal diplomatic relations. So we have that domestic law, but we also have agreements with the Chinese, which we see as consistent with one another, although the Chinese always point out, your activities undertaken under the Taiwan Relations Act are inconsistent with the 3 communiques and your commitment to us. Our efforts, our diplomats at the time, sought to reach those agreements in ways that were consistent with domestic law. So I think it is a reflection of sort of the sui generis challenge that was presented at the time, but I think it's at this juncture has enough in terms of legitimacy and underscoring of international norms that have developed to deal with this unique status.
Yeah.
I was going to say that to some extent, that as the question notes, this is a game that all sides play, and indeed the TRA, as far as we can tell, was very much in the minds of China's anti-secession law drafters. It also arose at a moment when Chen Shui-bian was doing something similar, changing Taiwan's domestic law to be more assertive about Taiwan's status. The legitimacy of either one of them is partly procedural, as Randy points out, but also the substantive one. It really depends which narrative you buy. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the TRA, and it is international relations of the formal type gone light and informal, and if you think Taiwan basically is a separate entity, that's perfectly fine. If you buy the Chinese view that this is a domestic law governing Chinese territory and Chinese people, then the anti-secession law is hard to object to. So each side is using the same or similar forms to advance its position, but obviously there's something fundamentally different about the threat to use force versus essentially stating the opposition to forcible changes in the status quo. Now, the status quo we can talk about. If I can just hit on one other thread that from what Yidong and Randy raised, there is pushback increasingly, and if we look at the moments of pushback against the Chinese characterization relying on 2758, they've been pretty notably effective. So there was a 2007 non-paper which got the UN to retrench for a while. And of course, just recently we had Mark Lambert do the statement of what 2758 does not do, essentially pushing back against the Chinese position. And those are the kind of pushbacks I think Vincent was arguing for. And it is important to engage that. And I also give some credit to Taiwan's diplomatic partners here. They've been quite forceful in the United Nations system of saying, hey, you're not only squeezing Taiwan, but you are essentially dissing us as members of the United Nations who have the right to submit documents referring to Taiwan as Taiwan rather than Taiwan province of China, and to push back against this for all intents and purposes. But as those comments suggest, in domestic legislation or on the international level, there's a very complicated game going here, and not to play the game is to start to lose it. And I think we've seen, China chose the UN as an arena for a good reason. It's one where they get one state, one vote. It's one where they can get lots of states for whom Taiwan is a low salience issue to go along with their position, and then try to parlay that into something that binds everybody internationally. And it's been an important addition to the repertoire that Randy alluded to, which is always stressing the 3 communiques in the TRA.
Thanks. Yeah, just to jump on, I think just to build on that a little bit, I think the law is itself not necessarily a good or a bad thing. So it's important to be willing to take on the merits of the laws, and so that's why I think, as a lawyer, I like it that people like to follow laws or take law seriously. But actually, not all law is the same, and so you have to address the merits. And I think that's where the work comes in, right? To say, actually, just because this is a law, it doesn't mean it's a good or just law, and so it requires. And I think on the anti-secession law, I think that's why you take it on a little bit, like what I would try to argue, that from within and say, look, even on its own terms, it's inappropriate or unreasonable. And also, another way to think about this is that the merits of the way China's interpreted its own domestic laws to really punish overseas activities, right? They haven't put a territorial limit on exactly how far this law applies. I mean, I think, I was thinking about like, I teach a class, right now I'm teaching a class on China and international law, and we're gonna have to talk about Taiwan's international legal status. I don't wanna accidentally violate Chinese law, but I probably have or done so already, especially I have some Chinese nationals in my classroom. I mean, and you gotta sort of address the merits and unpack it, illustrate in some ways just how unreasonable that is. The idea that, a Chinese student hanging out in some campus in the US is gonna have to worry about whether that person, or even an American student, violating this weird Chinese law that's unreasonable, and as argued kind of shows their insecurity. That's I think where you really, so you could have law, and this is a bad law, it's a dumb law, and that's part of the conversation, and it's not like other laws. I think that should be the type of conversation we need to have when we talk about this kind of use of law as a political instrument.
1 second, if I could just jump in here. I guess I've also always been puzzled why we're not pushing back as much, and I think part of it is the reason that you mentioned, right? The fear of punishment or the fear of Chinese retaliation. But I also wonder if there's a lack of distinction between pushing back against the anti-secession law and pushing back against Chinese claims over Taiwan. I think they get linked up, and that's why you have countries or officials who are unwilling to make statements, because they think that means if they push back against China's ability to use force, they're pushing back against what they may be, what their government might have in terms of one China policies. And I think they're completely separate, and we should separate them out. So even if countries align with China's view on Taiwan, that doesn't mean that they should accept the fact that China should be able to use force against Taiwan. And then there's a second tier question of what actually is Taiwan's status. But I think they get all jumbled up, and it makes it very difficult for any official to take a position on the anti-secession law.
So Julian has defended law. Let me critique law here. I think you point to one of the problems here, which is lawyers spend a lot of time working out the intricacies of this. And if you look at what actually happened in the two Office of Legal Affairs opinions in the UN that China now likes to invoke as settling the question of Taiwan's status, they actually don't do anything like that. But because the top line rhetoric is the UN considers Taiwan since 2758 to be an integral part of China with no independent status, or the UN since 2758 says you must refer to Taiwan as Taiwan province of China in UN documents. You get into what they actually do, and they say, oh, but on the nomenclature thing, any state that wants to submit a document can call Taiwan whatever it wants. We're not going to put a footnote on it. And the all intents and purposes language is in a very narrow context too. But what happens is it becomes a game of whisper down the lane. And by the time it gets to non-lawyers who are the frontline policy people, it's been reduced to Taiwan is part of China, full stop. And you see that in 2758 where it's quite on the surface. But I think you also see it in many states' diplomatic approaches to these. It's not the people from L who are doing the talking at the end of the day. It's people who say our state has a one China policy, and that must mean Taiwan is definitively part of China, even though if you dig into it, that's not the actual position.
I think Bonnie's points were excellent, actually, and I think they're fundamental to our understanding of the ASL, which is how do you call out difficulties and problems and challenges posed by the ASL without fundamentally changing your one China policy. And ultimately, the two are not related, as Bonnie points out, because the main issue with the ASL, I mean, the sovereignty under Article 2 aside, and again, that article is, I think, repeated under a whole series of policy pronouncements that are not limited to the ASL, but the main issue with the ASL is actually Article 8, which is, legally speaking, the authorization of non-peaceful means against Taiwan. And so fundamentally, I think we do have to divorce sort of the different aspects of the ASL and call the ASL out, particularly for their destabilizing actions on the military front and the potential employment of non-military means, non-peaceful means. And so with that being said, I think the difficulty we face right now is that, I mean, we do see growing challenges on the horizon in terms of cross-strait relations. We do see, for example, the culmination of military exercises against Taiwan. And many people, I think here in DC, but also around the world, question, I mean, where is all this leading to, number one, and number two, where the responsibility for this deterioration lies. And so from Taiwan's perspective, obviously, we've been very consistent in terms of cross-strait policy, not only between President Lai Ching-te, but also together with President Tsai Ing-wen as well. The past 8.5 years now, I think have been quite consistent in terms of how the DPP administration has managed cross-strait relations. And so I do think that there should be an increasing willingness to call out the ASL as a fundamental example of how the PRC is challenging, if not destroying the cross-strait status quo. And the ASL should be seen as a concrete example of that.
Thank you. I see a couple of questions. I think I saw a hand there. Let's just collect 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, please.
Hi. My question is, so in terms of this law, I'm curious the extent of it in these new interpretations. Like what I was thinking about, as well as recently the Olympics and how China had sort of a pull there in terms of making Taiwan represent as Chinese Taipei. So I'm curious as to what the interpretations of this new criminal law is. Is it that like I, for example, cannot directly say, okay, like Taiwan is a sovereign country, for example, or is it that like the representation of Taiwan itself is criminalized? And in addition, since the rollout of these new interpretations, have there been any examples that y'all know about in terms of whether people have been criminalized since, I believe, June? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's collect this one.
Yes, thank you. Malcolm Jorgensen from the Max Planck Institute. So my question relates to the broader systemic intentions of China and whether or not we have to think about the anti-secession law in those terms. So there are many parallels, it seems, between the anti-secession law and the foreign relations law of China from 2023, as in it doesn't necessarily grant a whole host of new powers, but it makes a clear statement about the kinds of intentions that China has and the extent of its own sovereignty. So these claims that China is perhaps more adherent to a Westphalian idea of sovereignty than other countries, such as the United States, is paired in China's case also with a more expansive notion of what that sovereignty entails. And that would entail a reconfiguration of the international legal order. And so my question is, how should we see the law in those broader strategic terms? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I don't think any of the questions were directed at any panelists, so whoever wants to jump in. I will say we are running short on time, so if we could wrap these comments up within 2 or 3 minutes, that would be great.
I will say that although right now I don't remember the exact implementation of these 22 articles and on the Taiwanese, but the effect already produced among the Taiwanese who are needed to go to China or whose career probably will rest on the Chinese market. And as you saw that already a good bunch of the entertainers and the internet celebrity in Taiwan, they started to voice out the position as the Chinese motherland and also the kind of the well, one China issues or my hometown is in China, those kind of statements. And basically that's why the forced the President Lai Ching-te in his double 10 days the night celebrations, and he made a speech that the ROC is actually the motherland of the citizen in PRC whose age is older than 75 years old. So I will say that the effect is not just about the implementation, it's on every single citizen in China and also in Taiwan. And also we already have the multiple examples of our international partners. They are afraid of their activities, especially they have a Chinese colleague in China, could be punished due to their cooperation with people in Taiwan who already been singled out as the violator of the anti-secession law, including prospect foundations. So we are not talking about some abstract the operation just on state individuals whose activity and expression already has been compromised.
But just on the sovereignty, I think you're right. The Foreign Relations Law of 2023 is very interesting. Among other things, actually, I was thinking it explicitly names the Chinese Communist Party as in the law itself as the guiding force for all foreign policy decisions, which is not usually explicitly stated in laws like that. So one, I think it's upfront in saying the party is in charge, the party is making all decisions here. The state is just subordinate to that in China. And second, you're right, it defines sovereignty as the core, but then it defines sovereignty as like a lot of things, including a lot of places that aren't actually part of China right now. So whether it's revisionist, they would see it as not revisionist. I think what's going on is a contest of ideas. And I think we have, again, the U.S. is promoting its own conception of the world order, and China's arguing its conception of the world order built around a very capacious definition of sovereignty is the appropriate way. And I think what we're going to see is a contest between these two visions and among different countries in the world. And I'm not sure, the U.S. needs to sort of promote its own vision in a more effective way, I think.
So response on the enforcement of the 22 articles and what actually happens. I mean, you could talk to Chinese interlocutors about this, and they say, "Oh, don't worry about it." That is a lot of threatening stuff there, but it's not really going to happen to that many people and all sorts of stuff. But of course, the point is the chill and the signaling. But on your question, I mean, it's an absolutely fair point. The Chinese foreign relation law is kind of funny because a lot of it contains a lot of international law washing, as it were. Right? We're fully in support of international law, we're fully this, that, and the other thing. Right? Very, very sort of play by the rules kinds of things. But as Julian points out, it doesn't take much scratching of the surface. It mentions the role of the party. There's a lot of it that is Xi Jinping's global fill in your adjective initiative. All 3 or 4 of them are in there. And we know that the notion of sovereignty, they're now I think like 16 or 17 different kinds of sovereignty on the list, so it's super expansive. The interesting question here is where is China going with that? And I think it's absolutely fair to say that there is a Westphalianism on steroids tradition, and there's still a lot of language like that. But there are little cracks here and there. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. One is, of course, the pretzel position they got into on Ukraine, where they defend sovereignty but somehow say what Russia is doing is somewhat acceptable. And there are the questions about what happens as China becomes a bigger player out there with interests inside other countries. This is the BRI concern and things like that. So do you get into some attempts to adjust what sovereignty means? China has squared the circle on this to some degree, to get back to the Taiwan question, of saying all of its territorial claims are simply getting back stuff it used to have. So it's not aggressive, it's revanchist at worst and sort of restorative. And so they've tried to draw that line. The question is, will that continue? My guess is they can do it for a long time because the kinds of influence that great powers like to have inside other countries no longer require formal imperialism. You can muck around and have other kinds of influence. And it says Taiwan, getting Taiwan, keeping Hong Kong, having gotten Hong Kong back, and keeping Tibet and Xinjiang from going anywhere, and plus the fly specks of islands in the East and South China Sea. That's just getting back what was once ours. That's going to be the narrative for a while. But you're right to say there will be this robust Westphalian notion, not just territorially, but in terms of things that get inside one's domestic legal system, that create binding obligations that you're not allowed to ignore in the discretionary exercise of your own sovereignty at home.
And I just want to clarify, could one of you talk about the implications of the 22 articles for non-Chinese, non-Taiwan citizens? Because I think it doesn't apply to just Chinese and Taiwan citizens.
I think Don Clark in the report addresses that. And it's actually the law is a little ambiguous with this. But I think the better reading of the law is that it applies to anyone in Taiwan, whether you're Taiwanese or not, and then arguably it also applies to anyone outside of China and Taiwan, whether you're Taiwanese or not. Although the standard technically a standard for prosecuting non-Chinese outside of China for something is a little harder, but in theory you're still subject to that as well. So it is potentially very expansive to, in theory, everyone, right?
Yes, to do a little bit of international law nerding out before Vincent gives us a real world answer, is as under international law, you are allowed with your own laws to regulate your own nationals' behavior abroad and actions abroad that have a significant impact in your own territory, as well as, of course, what goes on with your people in your territory. So if you bring Taiwan inside the fence, that gives you a lot of leverage against Taiwanese in Taiwan. But even for those outside the fence, China has a very expansive notion of when it's permissible to do that. What's doing the work here is not the 22 articles themselves, but rather the underlying provision of the Chinese criminal code, which is quite expansive on what it can do to regulate Chinese nationals' behavior abroad and what it can do to regulate anybody's behavior that has significant adverse impact in China.
Oh, just quickly, yeah, because we're out of time here. It's actually going to lead to, I think, quite interesting applications because nowhere in the 22 articles is there a distinction made between Chinese nationals, Taiwanese nationals, or citizens of other countries. And so within the 22 articles, there's actually a point which is they do penalize, for example, advocating Taiwan's participation in international organizations. Now, of course, the U.S. has been a very forceful proponent of Taiwan's participation. And so could that apply to U.S. citizens? I think that's an open question because at this point, nobody's really tried to see if that legal application is there. But I do think if we look at Hong Kong and the extraterritoriality of many of the laws that had applied to Hong Kong, I think that does give some, I think, substance to the idea that the PRC will do what they think they can get away with. Now, again, I think they've left the 22 articles quite ambiguous in terms of application, but certainly I think it should give the international community cause for concern because nowhere, again, is that distinction made between Chinese citizens or citizens of other countries.
Great, thank you. We are running a little bit late, so if I can ask the panelists to stay in our chairs while we invite our keynote speaker to help wrap up our closing remarks. So last but not least, we have Ambassador Jim Moriarty, who is the chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan from 2016 to 2023, to offer closing remarks. Prior to this, he was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia at the National Security Council 2002-2004, where he coordinated U.S. policy on East Asia, Southeast Asia, Pacific, and South Asia. He has also had a number of roles, but in our lack of time, I will save you to read his bio online. So with that, Ambassador Moriarty, please, your closing remarks.
Okay, so I think we can all agree here, at least I'm sure on the panel, that the Anti-Secession Law as passed in 2005 was a horrible thing. It basically, particularly Articles 2 and 8, it sort of asserted a sovereignty over Taiwan that did not meet the smell test. You know, they did not appoint officials, they did not hold elections, they did not control any of the territory. But worryingly, for me at least, was the Article 8 provision, which laid out certain conditions under which you could use force. One of which was, well, if they just give up hope for peaceful unification. That to me was always a ticking time bomb. It was always, we can decide when we've given up hope. But let's look at the context a little bit, okay? It's been discussed to some degree, but if you look back at it, that was a period when we were genuinely worried about Taiwan trying to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. Chen Shui-bian did have us scared. The moves towards referenda did have us scared. We oppose those moves, and I think that's part of the reason why, you know, the Anti-Secession Law got less attention than it did over the years. We were still stuck in that 2005 mode of saying, you know, the goal here is really just to prevent Taiwan independence, and that was something we could understand. I would argue that that context has tremendously changed, that nowadays, if you go to Taiwan, and I had the chance to go back recently, you can't find any support for Taiwan independence. You've had now the third DPP president in a row, the third term of DPP controlling the presidency. No move towards independence. It's basically died out. On the other hand, so Taiwan has changed tremendously in that regard. On the other hand, I'm going to ask the audience here, and you'll reach me if you can virtually, but does anybody here genuinely expect to see Taiwan peacefully, without coercion, decide to unify with mainland China in the foreseeable future? I certainly don't. You know, the lessons of Hong Kong, the brutality in Ukraine, there's just too much out there. You have a very well-informed, very intelligent electorate in Taiwan that basically has control over any sort of process through law that an executive might undertake to discuss even the possibility of unification. Okay. Now, looking back, another thing that has changed tremendously, if you look at the law as written, it provided for flexibility. This is another big change. The China of Hu Jintao, the China of Jiang Zemin, had no real desire to force the issue of Taiwan at all. They were perfectly willing to kick the can down the road. That has changed. Okay, you have Xi Jinping saying that we're not going to kick this can down the road to the next generation. We have to believe it. Another big thing that's changed, of course, is something that Randy referred to as the capability balance. China building more and more capability. And then you throw on the 22 articles, which basically resurrect a debate and a law and put pressure on the Chinese authorities themselves to do something. Finally, the biggest change, I believe, is China has changed. That basically, as opposed to the collective leadership you had during those good old days of Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Deng Xiaoping, you have one-man rule in China. That makes China extremely unpredictable. As we saw with the lifting of COVID-19, done overnight with no warning to anybody in the system, as far as I can tell. We don't want Xi Jinping to wake up one day and say, today's the day. We can make it work. We've got the capability. We have sapped Taiwanese will enough. The U.S. is not going to get involved. The only thing we can do under these conditions, and I'm going to leave you here with a very strong message, which is we need to build as effective a deterrent as possible, as quickly as possible. Xi Jinping is not irrational. Xi Jinping wants to leave Zhongnanhai on his own terms. Xi Jinping does not want a failed attempt to take over Taiwan to be the death knell for the Chinese Communist Party. So that gives us time. We do have that uncertainty in his own mind. We have to feed that uncertainty in the coming years every way we can. You've heard some of that here today. We do have to do a better job pushing back against the anti-secession law. The concept that China can use force whenever it decides that it has to because peaceful unification isn't going to work. Well, frankly, I think most of the Taiwan watchers in the mainland understand my view on this. There is no movement towards unification with China at all. They can hire a few people, they can use gangs to intimidate people, but basically, in a democratically ruled country where the legislature has to approve any moves towards negotiation with China, it's not going to happen. So, got to make sure he doesn't wake up that one day. Have I kept my remarks short enough? Have I launched enough fireworks out there to keep people worried and thinking about the issue going forward? The anti-secession law was bad. It's gotten much worse because not just the 22 opinions, but also because of the change inside China itself. What was once an issue that could be kicked down the road under Xi has become something much more urgent. Doesn't have to be. We can convince Xi Jinping, we can convince the party leadership that no, it's not going to work, then it's not going to happen. That's my thoughts.
Ambassador, thank you very much for sharing your remarks. And I also want to thank the panelists for sharing your insights too. For those of you who don't have the report, it is online. And if you can't find it, definitely email my team. We will try to share that with you. But with that, let me give a round of applause for Ambassador as well as all of our panelists.